This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, in Tallahassee, the House shuts down early as the budget stalemate has tensions rising. The big point of contention is whether to expand Medicaid to the people whose income is just above the poverty line. The clock is ticking, and legislators have until the end of June to settle their differences. And what are the implications for next year's elections of this impasse? Political Insights next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lohrei.
Welcome back. This week our panelists are Paula Dockery is a former state senator, a columnist, and a Republican. Barry Edwards is a political strategist and a Democrat. Dr. Daryl Paulson is a professor emeritus of government from USF St. Petersburg. And Brendan McLaughlin is the senior anchor and political reporter for ABC Action News. Well, welcome, everybody. Great to see you. Well, the Florida House this week caught many people by surprise and adjourned on Tuesday, 3 days early, due to a disagreement with the Senate over health care spending and Medicaid expansion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the House do now adjourn. Sine die.
Members, Representative Corcoran moves the House do now adjourn. Sine die. All in favor signify by saying yea. Opposed, no. Show the motion adopted. Sine die.
They're acting like children. They took the marbles and went home. And the people of the state of Florida are the ones that will suffer.
There'll be some that are going to high-five and joke around later. Nobody won today. Nobody won. Taxpayers lost.
The sudden adjournment means that the legislature has failed to finish its only required task. That's to pass a balanced state budget. The House and Senate are about $4 billion apart. Meantime, Democratic senators sued the House over the abrupt end of this year's annual session. They say House leaders violated the state constitution by leaving early. The Constitution states that neither chamber can adjourn for more than 72 hours without an agreement between both houses.
If the court finds in our favor, we will be seeking all remedies available, including finding any House member in contempt should they refuse to return.
Some bills were passed during the session: a 24-hour waiting period for abortion, large beer containers called growlers were okayed, and a tougher human trafficking law was passed. But many bills failed. A plan to protect and clean Florida's waterways failed to get Senate approval. So did an effort to allow concealed weapons permit holders to carry guns on campuses. Prison reform appears to be dead, and a bill that environmentalists say would open the door to fracking died. The legislature also failed to set aside any significant amount of money for land and water conservation as required under Amendment 1 to the state constitution. The big question now is, how will the two warring houses bridge their differences and pass a budget before July 1st?
So, Paula, have you ever seen a situation like this after all your years in the legislature?
Yeah, actually, yes. Not 3 days early, but there have been instances in my 16 years in the legislature where one chamber adjourned before the other. And the significance of it is a lot of people who don't follow the process closely, bills bounce back and forth. You have to have a House bill and a Senate bill, but they have to match at some point. And sometimes you work out your disagreements on a bill by bouncing it back and forth. If one chamber loses or leaves, then you're basically saying to the other chamber, take it or leave it. You no longer have the ability to do any amending. And that's how some of these big bills died, like prison reform.
Tensions seem pretty high. And these are two houses that are both controlled by Republicans, yet the Republicans aren't agreeing. They're not seeing eye to eye.
Right. And what's interesting here is both chambers had already acknowledged that they weren't going to get the budget done on time. So I don't understand the strategy behind the House leaving. Had they stayed till the end, which is really their constitutional requirement and duty to do so, had they stayed till the end, they could have bounced some bills other than the budget back and forth to the Senate. And the Speaker, Chris Cifulli, would have had his water bill, which I'm kind of glad it died because I don't think it was a very good bill. But I don't understand. You tend to lose control when you leave town. Had he stayed in town, they still weren't going to be doing the budget, but they could have gotten some of these other bills done, like the developmentally disabled. How do you justify leaving town when you can get that bill passed? And that would have been just a bounce or two back and forth between the chambers.
I want to talk about some of those bills in just a moment, but let's go to the Medicaid issue, which Darrell, was the sticking point, and it's been the sticking point since practically the start of this legislative session. The House doesn't like, I think it's fair to say, Obamacare. So anything that would help Obamacare, like Medicaid expansion, they were against it, right?
Absolutely right. And the House's position is that Medicaid expansion was never on the agenda. The leader of the House, Christofouli, said that when he met with the president of the Senate, Gardner, they set their priorities. They had 5 specific legislative items that they wanted to make sure would pass. Medicaid expansion wasn't on the list, and it wasn't until the second week of the session that the Senate president introduced Medicaid expansion and tied it in with the passage of the budget. So the House believes that they were tricked, you might say. They also oppose it, of course, because they say the federal government created the problem, not the state of Florida. They believe they're right because they say Jeb Bush supports our position and Governor Scott supports our position, and they believe that the LIP funds will eventually pass, although I'm not so sure about that.
Now we should say what the LIP funds are. The LIP funds are...
This is money that goes to hospitals that treat low-income patients, and the federal government provides $1.5 million to $2 million to help hospitals to subsidize their costs for treating people that don't have health care insurance.
We should say billion, not million.
Billions, absolutely. Yeah. You know, you lose your perspective sometimes when you're talking about government money. But it's a lot of money, and many of these hospitals would lose, up to $90 million of their revenue if the LIP funds were not passed.
Now, the governor has said in the last 2 weeks that hospitals are making a lot of money. They're profitable, and so they don't need any sort of health care reform. They don't need any of these health issues to pass.
Somewhat strange coming from a governor who headed HCA, the Hospital Corporation of America, and was touted his own campaign for governor because he was so successful in running that corporation and maximizing their profits, and he would do the same thing for the state of Florida. So it seems to me a rather spurious kind of argument to make at this point.
Let's stick on the Medicaid issue for a little bit. Brenda, what's your sense on, being the political reporter over there at Channel 28, what's your sense about the public? Are they interested in Medicaid expansion here in Florida? These 800,000 people that stand to get health insurance, is that an issue out there in
Well, I think the debate in Tallahassee has sort of tried to cast this as a budget issue, and it is tied into the budget. The Medicaid situation is linked to that. You can't get away from that. But at its heart, it's really the difference between people who believe we have an obligation as a government, as a society, to pay for Medicare or medical care for people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. And there are people who don't believe we should do that. And that's really at the heart of the debate right now. And the Senate, obviously, is maybe being a little bit more pragmatic in the sense that they're willing to take federal money that's sitting out there to take care of this need. The House seems to be standing on principle, saying that we don't want to take federal money because we're small government people. We don't want to add to the deficit. But again, I think it really comes down to them, those members of the House, feeling that this is not a role for government.
Mm-hmm. But the House is taking federal money, but at the tail end, after somebody who doesn't have insurance goes through the most expensive way you can get your medical insurance,
Precisely.
And that's the emergency room. So how principled a stance is it if you're willing to take the federal money to reimburse hospitals, but not willing to insure?
Oh, and what about highway funds and everything else? In other words, they're being selective about what federal money they want to take and what federal money they don't want to take.
Barry?
A third of our, right, exactly. A third of our state budget, a third, $27 billion is from the federal government. So if we're really concerned about the deficit, we would return all that $27 billion tomorrow. Let's quit building roads. Let's quit spending that money on education and everything else. So that's a specious argument. And two, if the money's going to be spent, if we don't take the money, it's going to go to California or Texas. So we're not reducing. So that's another specious argument.
So you're saying the federal deficit is not being reduced by our refusal to take the federal money?
They're going to spend it on another state. And on this show 2 or 3 weeks ago, some of your legislators talked about the money. They said they didn't want China to hold our debt. Well, that's Pat Moynihan said everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own set of facts. And the chairman of the Republican Party is wrong. 66% of our debt is held by domestic people in America. Only 34% of our debt is held by foreign countries. Japan owns 7.2%, China only 7%. So that's factually wrong, too.
House Speaker Steve Crisafulli said this week in an op-ed in the Tampa Bay Times that Florida is no longer a donor state, that we actually collect more money from the federal government than we send in tax revenue. Is he correct on that?
No.
Why not?
From 2008 to 2013, we were a heavily donor state. But in 2014, we collected $154 billion in taxes from Floridians, and we received back $150 billion. So we're at 0.97%. So almost, but not quite. But my question is, who cares? For 10 years, we were spending 10, 20, 30 billion to Alaska, to Connecticut, to California. Let's get our fair share back. Our congressional delegation is finally doing their job and bringing our money back in. So all these arguments that the Republicans are using in the House are specious. They're just not correct.
Just a couple. The Kaiser Family Foundation, which is a respected sort of bipartisan organization looking at health care issues, did a study on the impact of Medicaid expansion in all the 50 states. And what they found specifically for Florida is that over the next 10 years, Medicaid expansion would cost the state of Florida $70 billion. Now, that's not a tiny sum of money, but they also point out that the federal government would pick up 90% or better than 90% of the cost, so the state of Florida would only pay $5 billion of that $70 billion cost. Now, that's still a lot of money, $5 billion, but in exchange for that, you're providing health care coverage to $800,000. The Kaiser family thought that was a pretty good trade-off for the state of Florida, and this week, of course, Montana became the 29th of the 50 states to accept the Medicaid funds.
But the argument against it, you know, for Speaker Crisafulli and others, they say Medicaid is a failed program, that you have worse outcomes when you have Medicaid, and if you're expanding Medicaid, what you're doing is you're saddling our children and grandchildren with debt. Well, Paula, what would you say? And Barry, then we'll go to you.
I would say that that's a great spin, but it's not the facts. And the federal government has shown willingness to let some of these other 29 states revamp their Medicaid program to have their own state needs addressed in it. And that's what the state Senate did in Florida. And they made it a market-based program where the individuals who would be accessing it, if it expanded, would have private health insurance. So now you have private insurance companies involved. You don't have the broke system. The other interesting thing is this broke system that they're talking about. We just bragged a few years ago about how we fixed our Medicaid system in Florida. So I don't understand why they're considering it broke, but the plan that the Senate is sending to the federal government still would need to be approved, and it's not what is currently existing in the Medicaid program.
You want to get into this.
And a couple weeks ago on your show, one of the Republican legislators said before they look to the government, they need to look themselves in the mirror. Well, these are not unemployed people. These are not deadbeats. These are the working poor. And their whole Republican mantra is we want to help the working poor and give them a hand up, not a hand out, and we're not being consistent with their own philosophy.
This is the group of people that's between 100% and 138% of poverty.
They don't qualify.
And it includes students, and it includes veterans, too. Mm-hmm. That's who's in this group. And as you said, the working poor.
Well, and let's not paint all Republicans with the same brush. The Republicans in the Senate are going forward with this, and they are now backed for the first time by some business groups, by some hospitals, by some doctors, and governors in other states. And even our governor said before re-election that he couldn't in good conscience not expand Medicaid. Now he's suing to not give these 800 and something thousand of Florida's working poor health insurance.
And I think the reason for this is in the Senate they have larger districts, and so you have to be more moderate. The House districts are so drawn, just like a rapier, that no Republican legislator, other than maybe 3 or 4, has any threat of being beat by a Democrat. So they're worried about a challenge from their right, a Republican Tea Party, are taking them out.
Okay,
and that's
so
what's motivating them.
Explain what's going on here, too, because to that point, Americans for Prosperity, one of the groups, the group that founded the Tea Party, has been sending out press releases throughout this whole process saying that they're cheering the House and cheering the governor for standing firm against expanding Medicaid. So how does that play into this idea that these House districts are drawn so narrowly that, you know, I mean, what we're talking about is
Republican fear of being primaried.
Correct.
Right? Is that right?
Correct. There's maybe 5 districts that I think the Democrats would probably say 7 districts that they could take from the Republicans. Okay. I think there's really only 5. But anyway, that's an argument. But so the other 76 Republicans don't have any threat from a Democrat. Their only threat is a Republican from the right, a Tea Party or more conservative Republican, taking them out in a primary.
Brendan, I want to ask you about the role of the governor in all this. Because Paula talked about the governor a moment ago. How prominent is the governor involved in this, or is he just kind of like along for the ride in this?
Well, some would say that he's had a negative effect on this by sending a mixed message. As Paula pointed out, he initially said that he thought expanding Medicaid was the right thing to do, and then he backtracked. His explanation for that was that because the federal government was going to take away the LIP funds down the road, and he said so they backtracked on that, so we can't trust that they're going to continue paying for the Medicaid expansion 90% like they say they will. So it's a mixed message that got sent to the House, and the fact that he's really kept a very surprisingly low profile here. He really hasn't spoken out or taken to the podium to exert what he wants. Mm-hmm. But back to Barry's point, I think the Republicans basically are going to have no consequences as a result of this because of the districting. A Republican friend of mine tried to draw an analogy between the State House and Jameis Winston, sort of clumsily. All he could come up with is that they both like shellfish, which is probably true.
Daryl, what about the role of the governor?
I disagree with that position.
The shellfish?
No, of Brendan, that the Republicans won't pay anything for this because I think you have in Florida's prior history great examples of parties who have paid for making mistakes. And the last time was in the early 1990s when the Democrats were quite frankly pathetic. They'd been in power for 100 years. They always thought they'd be in power. They controlled the legislature. They had 60% of the seats in the House and the Senate in 1990. They drew the legislative district lines in 1992. And even though the Democrats drew the legislative district line, within 4 years, the Republicans controlled both the Florida House and the Senate. So something went wrong. So I think if the Republicans are optimistic that they won't pay a price for this, all they have to do is look at prior history. If people become upset enough, and if the Democrats could ever get their act together, which of course is a huge if, and exploit this with great leadership, they could overnight transform Florida politics.
But Daryl, let me ask you what I asked Brendan. That is, has the governor shown leadership here?
A lack of leadership, but no, he really hasn't shown any leadership. He started out, when he first ran for governor, he was opposed to Obamacare, and he was opposed to Medicaid expansion, and then he came out and said in good conscience he couldn't oppose it, and of course his good conscience apparently went away, and he's now opposed it. He said 2 years ago that he opposed the House plan because this was like making Floridians pay twice for it, health care, and he supported the Senate plan. So he's changed completely on this issue, and instead of being there in Tallahassee and trying to resolve these issues to some extent, he's making appearances at Wawa gas stations.
And on his comment that you can't trust the federal government because the LIP funds are going away, the LIP funds was a 5-year program. We received those funds for 5 years. Then
this is the program that went to fund the hospital.
Right. Then we
for their emergency room care.
Then we got an extension for another 3 years. Then the federal government said it's going away. Last year, the state did nothing to plan for it going away, so they begged the federal government, give us 1 more year extension. So the federal government did last year. So it had its 5 years, it's 3 years, and then it's 1 year, and said, but June 30th of 2015, it's going away. What did Governor Scott or the House do in that year to prepare for this? And now all of a sudden, they act surprised that it's going away.
Paula, the governor is suing to preserve that LIP funding at least for another year. So that funding goes to fund emergency rooms at hospitals. The Senate is saying, we want to provide private insurance to these low-income people, low-income workers, and let them make their own health decisions and do some preventive care. Which is the better way to spend tax dollars?
Well, obviously, preventative care is better than treating somebody when the situation gets so bad they end up in an emergency room. It's less expensive, it has better outcomes, but you may need a little bit of both, because there still may be some people that even if Medicaid is available to them, they're not insured and they end up in a hospital and the hospital doesn't get reimbursed for their care. And that's what the federal government's been saying, is there's a tie here. We will look at, you have to file an application for LIP funding, but the program went away. If this is to supplement what you're doing with Medicaid, then show us your plan. but we want some accountability. We don't want to throw money at you to throw at hospitals, and some of the hospitals who don't need it are getting a share when some hospitals who need more aren't getting enough.
I want to ask you about bills that passed or bills that failed. Can we talk about, I mentioned the abortion bill, I mentioned the Growler bill. Any good bills passed this time? I mean, not making a judgment on those two bills, but did you like any of the bills, or do you think that the public is benefiting by anything that did pass? And is the public suffering by anything that failed to pass this session?
Well, the juvenile justice bill that allows first-time offenders to receive a citation instead of a misdemeanor, I think that's a big deal and a very positive step and long overdue. Also, the gay rights thing, which was a foregone conclusion because the Supreme Court obviously upheld gay rights in Florida, but it was taken off the books.
This is the ban on gay adoptions, taken off the books.
Gay adoption, rather. So that at least, puts a period at the end of that issue here. One thing that they didn't take up, and again, this isn't life or death. I'm tired of the Growler issue, by the way. I mean, I like beer as much as the next guy, but, basta on that. But the Uber question, that was tabled as well. And there's so much uncertainty in Hillsborough County as a result of that. The Public Transportation Commission is at war, basically, with Lyft and Uber and these other ride-sharing services, which, by the way, are widely used. They're not going away. They're only going to get bigger. And the legislature had a chance to sort of bring some clarity to that and have a statewide law that would accommodate both taxi cabs and ride-sharing services.
And
that's
they
not
didn't
going to
do
happen.
it. Any other
The
bills?
legislature passed 142 bills. And strangely enough, the House, which considers itself far more conservative, passed about 80 of those bills, and the Senate passed about 60 of them, or the origins of those legislation. So normally, from a conservative perspective, the less legislation, the better off everyone is. But yeah, there are a lot of things that didn't pass. The Seminole Compact, which generates $260 million in revenue for the state of Florida. This was supposed to be the year of comprehensive water policy. That didn't pass. Amendment 1, which the voters passed overwhelmingly. The funds for that weren't distributed. The developmentally disabled that we talked about, that didn't pass. And $600 million in refunds for customers of Duke Energy, which would primarily apply to the Tampa Bay area. That also got lost in the process.
Paul,
okay, so here's what passed that was good. Child welfare, although it was just tweaking things, it wasn't big and bold. Testing in schools, although it was just tweaking things, it wasn't big and bold. The Public Service Commission, but it was the House version was drastically watered down, and the Senate ended up passing it just because the House adjourned, so that was all they had to work with, and that was watered down. I guess it was the year of the Growlers. Now, I love the Growler bill, but that should have been completed the first year that it was filed.
Have you ever bought a Growler, Paula?
No, I haven't,
okay.
But I'm going to, because that would be illegal. So it was the year of the Growlers. And then I'd say probably the best bill that passed, and the governor's threatening to veto it, is online voter registration.
Barry, what's your take on the legislation passed and not passed?
Well, I think the prison reform has been a crisis. And there again,
Absolutely.
This legislature doesn't seem to care about the people that don't have a lot of power. And people in prison, we need to respect you. You're judged on how you treat the people with the least power. Another one that was good that affected my county of Pinellas was, and the same person who sponsored the civil citation bill was Representative Rasan. We have the first bill in Florida history that actually has some breaking and restrictions on gun use. We now cannot have a gun range in your backyard if you live in a city. And that's just common sense. But we were able to spend time talking about extending the waiting periods for abortion, and that's not a pro-life or a pro-choice, that's just a pro-mean. These are people that have limited resources, typically, and we just added another day off, so it's just pro-mean. We also spent time spending on where you could go to the bathroom and who could use what bathroom. And on the gay adoption bill, that originally turned into trying to allow private companies the ability to opt out. So it seems like we want to be mean to people rather than to do things to help people.
We're down to the last minute or so, but is there anything else? Well, let me take this tack. How can the House and Senate get together and come up with a budget? What do you think the solution is?
They have to do something by July 1. That's when our budget year starts. And so some of these big issues, like Amendment 1, which both chambers of the legislature did a horrible job of amending what the voters really intended, that has to be part of the budget deal. And I would hope that they'd bring prisons back because that's certainly going to be a funding issue as well. But I don't know how you even bring the two chambers back until the Medicaid issue and the LIP funding are resolved. And
were there any heroes in this past 8 weeks of the session?
There were a lot of heroes.
Name one or two of the heroes. In
Andy Gardner, Tom Lee, Senator Joyner, Jack Latvala, the Senate. All the heroes were in the Senate.
Yeah. Any other heroes? Daryl, we have 30 seconds.
Greg Evers on the prison issue.
30 seconds. What else would you like to say about the session and maybe how to make it right? How can they come together?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult. As Tom Lee said, it's like being jolted at the altar. How do you put things back together again? And that's going to be the tough task facing the legislature whenever they meet. I mean, they're so polarized now, and you don't expect this because normally you expect disputes between one party and the other party. This dispute is within the Republican Party. It's what I call bifactionalism. And it was very common in the South where you only had one party rule, and we still have it in the state of Florida. The factions are within the Republican Party, and it's very difficult to mend those splits because they're based on, just like polarization between the parties, there's polarization within the Republican Party today.
All right. Well, before we go, what other news stories should we be paying attention to? Barry, let's start with you. Your other big story.
I think the big story is last week the Supreme Court issued subpoenas for depositions on the Senate redistricting, and they set a trial for September. I think in May they're going to rule on congressional redistricting, and in September they'll rule on the Senate redistricting. I think this time you're going to see some districts altered from one party to the other.
All right, Brendan, your other big story.
It's National Bike Month, starts this weekend, and I looked into Tampa's bike share program, which started just about 5 months ago, to see how they were doing. 40,000 miles of rides, some 15,000 trips, 8 flat tires and all of that, and 0 fatalities or injuries. And beyond that, I looked into this, and over the last 7 years that they've kept records on this, there has not been one fatality in a bike share program nationwide.
Wow, that's incredible. Daryl, your other big story.
I'd like to talk about Governor Rick Scott's leadership. Nothing to say about Governor Rick Scott's leadership. I mean, it really hasn't been good. It's been bad for Florida. It's, I think, due to the fact that he was an outsider in politics. He didn't understand the process. He didn't know the people that he would deal with, didn't know the rules of the legislature. His chief of staff that he originally appointed had no experience in government either, so he was an outsider leading an outsider. He bullies the legislature. At the same time, he accused the federal government of bullying the state of Florida with respect to the LIP funds. He called in the legislature and said, I'm going to veto your priorities unless you back me up on these programs. So instead of being a leader, as I said, he's been at grand openings of Wawas and other major events.
How do you really feel?
And Ferris wheels.
Follow your other story.
Well, a court in California just ruled that Google has to release Governor Scott's Gmail account emails, and so that's going to be interesting to see what's going to come out of that.
All right. Well, thank you all for a great show, and thank you for watching Florida This Week. We want to hear from you. You can write us at ftw@wedu.org or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. And you can watch this show online on the wedu.org website beginning Monday morning. We'll see you next Friday night at 8:30 and Sunday afternoon at 12:30. And from all of us here at WEDU, have a great weekend.
Florida This Week is a production of WEDU, who is solely responsible for its content.